Mr. Hine.
Present.
Mrs. Appleby. Here. Mr. Hettinger.
Here.
Mr. Morris.
Here.
Mr. Munson.
Here.
Mr. Mikeward.
Here.
And Mr. Glenn.
Here.
May I have a motion to approve the May 23rd, May 29th, May 30th, and June 13th spatial board minutes, and the May 15th regular board minutes?
So moved.
Mr. Morris,
Second.
second Mr. Glenn.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Glenn, to approve the minutes of the May 23rd, May 29th, May 30th, and June 3rd special board meetings, and the May 15th regular board meeting.
Discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Mikeward?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
And Mr. Hine?
Yes.
There are no transfers or emergency appropriations. May I have a motion to approve the payments of the county's financial obligations?
So moved.
Mr. Glenn, second.
Second.
Mr. Hahn.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Glenn, seconded by Mr. Hine, to approve the payments of the county's financial obligations.
Discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Mikeward?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
And Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
And may I have a motion to approve the reports of the fees of the county offices?
So moved.
Mr. Hettinger, second.
That's second.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Morris. There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Hettinger, seconded by Mr. Morris, to approve the reports of fees of county offices.
Discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Mikeward?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
And Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
Mr. Mikeward, would you present item 8, please?
I will, sir. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve to sign the non-urbanized area transportation operating and administrative agreement between Douglas County, the primary participant, and Coles County Council on Aging, the provider for fiscal year 2020.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Mrs. Applebee's.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Mikeward, seconded by Mrs. Appleby, to approve to sign the non-urbanized area transportation operating and administrative agreement between Douglas County, the primary participant, and Coles County Council on Aging, the provider, for fiscal year 2020.
Discussion. Roll call.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Mikeward?
Yes?
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
And Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Before we take up item 9 here, I'm going to depart just a little bit from our normal procedure from the standpoint that after our study session on Friday, there were some agreed upon updates and changes to some of the articles in the application. And even though the WEX committee did meet yesterday, looked those over, and made their recommendation, there are some board members here who I think have just gotten copies of these. And I guess what I want to do is just ask if anybody has any further questions regarding these new updates. And our clerk has just also informed me that she has the new updated performance bond duty?
It's the decommissioning bond, right here it is.
Here it is. Decommissioning performance bond with the new figures, and it is all duly presented. And I think that was the last item that we were sort of waiting on, that we had agreed upon with EDPR to make those changes. So it's my understanding that we are now fully, the application is fully complete. Is there any other discussion, question?
I have something, but I was waiting for the motion to be made.
Pardon me?
Well, I was waiting for the motion to be made.
I
before I
can,
was
if you would
comment.
prefer, I will do that, Vivi.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, very good. Since seeing there are no other questions, then I would ask whoever pleases to present item 9.
I'll do it.
Mr. Morris?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I move that at the recommendation of the WECS Ordinance Subcommittee to grant building permit to Broadlands Wind Farm LLC applicant, a wholly owned subsidiary of EDP Renewables North America LLC, to construct a new wind power generation facility at Harvest Ridge Wind Farm in Douglas County.
Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Hedinger. Discussion.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Hedinger, that at the recommendation of the WECS Ordinance Subcommittee to grant a building permit to Broadlands Wind Farm LLC applicant, a wholly owned subsidiary of EDP Renewables North America LLC, to construct a new wind power generation facility, the Harvest Ridge Wind Farm in Douglas County.
Discussion.
Okay, sir, I understand that our highway person recommended not to pass this ordinance yesterday. Am I not correct that he voted against it? Jim Crane?
I
Is he-
think that's correct, yes, yeah,
Okay, he did vote against it. He
Yeah.
recommended that we not accept it.
yeah.
Okay. My question, well, I don't have a question, I just have a statement. In our history, we have had snake oil salesmen appear in towns to sell their concoctions. We had peddlers come to town to sell their things with their fancy, noisy wagons with horses pulling them. Today, in my mind, people are being scammed by these people. Just take, for instance, right now, people who are coming in and wanting to blacktop driveways, and the blacktop does not last a year. We have people who are, I got 2 phone calls yesterday who wanted me to say yes. They said, "Can you hear me?" And I just said goodbye. We have people who want to put lightning rods up on elderly people's roofs, which is a total ripoff. As far as I'm concerned, this is a major ripoff. These things are not popular in Europe anymore. They do not know how to get rid of them because of the fiberglass and the things that go around. The World Health Organization recommends that they are detrimental to people's health. And that is why I will be voting no today, because I care more about our land that God has given us to raise food than I care about these things that are intermittent at the most. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy.
Yes, sir.
Is there any other discussion from any of the board members? Yes, Mr. Moore.
I will say that my wife and I, 2 weeks ago on Saturday, toured the California Ridge. And until we had completed that visit, I was on the fence. During that time, we spoke to several people we didn't know anybody. We just drove up their driveways. I went at one place with a couple, and their names were Mike and Lori Flugmacher. They have one on it's their dad's property. They have one on their property behind their house. They have one across the road to the east and across the road to the south. Mrs. Flugmacher, when the California Ridge was being proposed 10 years ago, was steadfast against it. More or less led the group that was against putting the California Ridge wind farm in. There's 131, if I remember my numbers correct, windmills up there. She has completely changed her mind, and basically the result of talking to them was that, and they have 3 within the vicinity of their house, was what windmill? Because they become part of the environment, I guess you would say. We talked to other people, one who had one right across the road, just barely outside the limit up there, which I think is 1,300 feet, but I don't know. He confirmed that Mrs. Flugmacher, who was a classmate of his in high school, was one of the leaders of the opposition when that windmill farm was proposed. Going back to Mrs. Flugmacher, she is now completely at ease with the wind farm and indicates that it basically saved their little high school and their school district up there. The last gentleman we talked to with the windmill right across the road from his house indicated, confirmed her opposition and indicated to that as far as noise was concerned, that if the wind was calm and the turbine was facing his house, there could be a slight noise. If the blades were facing his house, there could be a slight noise, but you could only hear it if the wind was calm. And indicated that the railroad made much more racket than the windmill did. As a result of that and other readings that I have done, I have changed my view or become in favor of this proposal, and only hope that as whatever result happens here in the next few minutes, that all of us get along with neighbors, and we can't let this interrupt the general flow of cooperation between citizens in our communities. I know I received one more thing. I received an email yesterday from a gentleman that indicated that at one time, years ago, in 1938, they were going to put electricity, his dad wanted to put electricity to his house. Landowners between where the electricity was and their house wouldn't let him, wouldn't agree to the electricity coming across because it was for whatever reason. Anyway, and I think that we have to just remember that all these things happened in the past, that sometime or other people were against it. They have come to be used to it or accept it. And I hope that that's the case here in Douglas County. Thank you.
Anybody else? I would like to make a statement in regard to this whole process. I was one of the members that's still on this board that was here when we passed the original ordinance 10 years ago. And I would still like to say that it's a good ordinance. Does it need some tweaking moving forward? Yes. But in the situation being as it was, I am still believe that we followed the right path in not making any tweaks at this point. And further, I would like to commend my fellow board members and for the meeting that we had last Friday, because I thought it, by waiting the 2 weeks or so from the public hearing, I felt like it gave us all a pause to consider the comments of the Douglas County citizens that were at that meeting and those that wrote in. And I think that we've all tried to do our due diligence. I think that through our discussions, as I've sort of pointed out this morning, we were able to gain some, I won't say concessions, but in speaking specifically to the aerial application problem, if there's something that needs its language cleaned up, it's that one paragraph in there. It's a paragraph that you won't find, I don't think, in any other ordinance in the state of Illinois regarding wind farms. I don't think. I'm not positive about that. It was done with good intent. The language is a little confusing. You can interpret it however you want to interpret it. But I think the important thing to realize is that out of whichever interpretation you want to take of that, the biggest problem with it was not exactly how you interpret it, it was the remedy that was put forward by the applicant, which I thought was totally one-sided and was not giving sufficient protection to those that were not participating, especially those who were not adjacent and participating. We asked the applicant if that could be changed, and they have changed that. And to me, it's affording a lot more protection. And I just want to thank my fellow board members for their time and the thoughtfulness and however they vote. fine with you. Thank you. Any other discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Mike Worth?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
I'll have to abstain because of conflict of interest.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby?
No.
Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
And Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Motion passes 5-2.
Is there any other new business to be brought before the board? Is there any question or comments from the press?
Can I ask Mr. Glenn why you abstained because of the conflict of interest? What is your conflict?
I can,
What's your conflict of interest?
I leased a turnout off of Route 36 to the wind company. And
But if
they,
you knew this a year ago, why did you stay on the board? If you knew.
ma'am, I abstained from a
Mr.
vote.
Glenn, you, as chairman, you do not have to answer any questions.
Okay.
But as our representative, we should have answers.
In the perfect world, you're probably right.
You got it. Yes, sir.
I found this a few months ago, and it was in a part of the News Gazette. It says, as yet, the wind is an untamed and unharnessed force, and quite possibly one of the greatest discoveries hereafter to be made will be the taming and harnessing of it. Abraham Lincoln, 150 years ago said that. Thank you.
Are there any other comments? If not, is there any need for an executive session?
I say no.
If not, Mr. Glenn, I will entertain your motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn until July 17th of 2019 at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Is there a second? Mr. Hague.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Glenn, seconded by Mr. Hettinger at 9:21 a.m. There being no further business to come before the county board to adjourn to July 17, 2019 at 9 a.m.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
And Mr. Mike Worth?
Yes.
Meeting's adjourned.